Hello, church family. Pastor Dennis here with this week's video devotional. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd, and I'm excited about church this evening. We'll have our normal services, classes for all ages, starting at 6:30 p.m. this evening, so I hope to see you there. But today I want to offer you a word of encouragement and something that came from my personal yearly Bible reading that I go through, and Emily and I go through each year. We do one on the YouVersion Bible app, so I highly recommend if you need some structure in reading through the Bible in a year, check out YouVersion. They've got a few different plans that you can pick from that we enjoy going through each year. But in today's passages, in today's reading, I came across one that every time I come across it, it strikes me again as significant and just amazing to think about. But toward the end of Genesis, we know about the story. We read about the story of a man named Joseph. He was the second youngest of 12 brothers, and the one that his brothers were jealous of. He was his father Jacob's favorite son, so the other brothers were jealous of him, and maybe rightly so in some sense. But they sold him into slavery. They wanted to get rid of him out of the family from their jealousy, and so they sold him into slavery. And he's taken to Egypt, and he becomes a slave in Egypt. And God blesses him while he's there, gives him favor with Potiphar and with Pharaoh. Makes him a very important ruler in Egypt. And so we read about this story at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 45, and Joseph's family, there was a famine in the land, and so they had come to Egypt to buy grain for bread and for food. And Joseph is the one who's overseeing that. He's the one who's administering that to people from all over the world coming to Egypt to buy grain. And in Genesis 45, he finally reveals himself to his brothers who had come to Egypt. It says this: "Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Does my father still live?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'Please come near to me.' So they came near. Then he said, 'I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt.'" So Joseph, like I said, he reveals himself to them, but he wants to reassure his brothers who are now going to be scared and feel guilty about selling their brother. They assumed he was probably dead by this point. And so they were amazed to find out that not only was he alive, but he was the ruler, only second in command to Pharaoh himself there in Egypt. But what's striking about this passage is when he tells them to not be grieved or angry with themselves because they sold him here, for God had sent him before his brothers to preserve life. He said in verse 7, "And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God." And so he attributes this really bad event, or this what was meant for harm, he'll say later in chapter 50, but he attributes this negative thing that happened, not necessarily just to his brothers. Yes, they're the ones who committed the crime, I guess, they committed the act of selling him into slavery, but he could look back now and say God actually was at work in this. That God had his hand on this. God is the one who sent me here. And my question for us is, how often when we go through something bad, when we are the receiving end of other people's evil and wickedness, how often do we then look and say, God, how are you going to work in this? Let me help us to see your hand in this evilness and in this hardship that we're going through. Because I do believe that as God's people, as believers, that he desires to use the negative and the wicked and the evil things that happen to us for his glory and for his honor. And he does have a purpose in those things. He uses those to make us more like his son. And so I want us to think about, is that how you respond? Or do you just think, woe is me, everything bad happens to me? Or do we look at those situations and say, how is God at work in this? We believe that God is at work all the time and in everything. And even our bad situations, we could say, how is God at work in this? The second thing I want to mention from this passage is the picture of Christ that we see here. This is obviously the Genesis, very first book of the Bible, so it's pretty far removed chronologically and timeline-wise from Jesus' life. But I want us to see Jesus and Christ in this passage, because Jesus also suffered at the hands of men, just like Joseph did. He was also persecuted, and he was actually killed at the hands of men. And that wickedness, that evilness, that horrible act, God meant for good. God meant that to save people, just as Joseph said. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And that's exactly what Jesus did when he suffered for us. He was sent by the Father, sent by God. God had his hand in that as well. Sent by the Father to suffer, but then to save, so that we could be saved. And that's what we should recognize here in Joseph. Is it's a picture of what Christ would do, suffering at the hands of men, but then saving people due to that suffering and due to God's plan. So hopefully you can recognize that. We should seek to see Christ and to recognize the gospel in every passage that we come to. But how do you respond when bad things happen? Do you get down on yourself, or do you look for how God is working? And then we need to recognize Christ in everything that we do, every passage that we read. So hope this encourages you today. Hope this blesses you this week. Again, we have service this evening at 6:30, tonight, Wednesday. And then our services again on Sunday, small groups at 9:30, large gathering at 10:30. Hope to see you all there. God bless.